Hello, fellow viewers. You're once again welcome to another edition of Smart Money Talks.
Thoughts.
And as you all
And as you
know,
all know,
I'm
I'm
here
here
today
today
again
again
with
with
Erwin.
Erwin Wiz, who is calling in from Abidjan. And my name is Munja Shelley. Today we are going to be looking at the principles around environmental, social, and governance, right? So we have to look at why this matters to your business and what this is all about. Because I know most of the times when you talk about ESG, there are a lot of people who actually wonder, is this for big, large organizations or for small organizations? So all this is going to constitute part of our discussions today. And how can this actually even help your business, right? How can this maybe enhance your business for investors? So today we're going to be looking at all this. Hi, Erwin. Hi, Sabijan
Ashley,
today.
yeah, it's good. It's
How?
it's good here. Very nice. Happy to be back on the
Okay,
show.
okay, okay. Always glad to have you around. So, Erwin, today we're going to be talking about environmental, social, and governance principles, right? How it actually how we can actually use this to be able to enhance our businesses or why it even matters to the business in the first place, right? So someone that is listening to us today, what do you expect the person to take home at the end of this discussion?
Yeah. So I mean, the idea is really to give a bit of an overview of what is behind this ESG. I mean, it's a lot talked about a lot. The definitions of what it includes can be very wide, and one to cover in depth it could probably take a couple of sessions. But just broadly, what does it entail? And then why, as a small business owner, why should you care about it? I think that's really the most important thing. But before I come to the why should we care about it part, I think maybe it's just useful to examine a little bit what's behind each of these categories. So for the environmental
Okay.
criteria,
So when you talk about yeah,
sorry.
yes, Erwin, you're spot on. I think I was just about to ask you to kind of like expatiate on what this ESG is really all about.
So for environmental criteria, one would it looks at how a company considers safeguards in the environment. That includes managing the carbon footprint, waste management, resource conservation. It also goes into the direction of climate risk, where you can be either exposed to physical climate risk, which is things like droughts, um, uh, rising sea levels, floods, things like that, or transition risk, where you're exposed to the transition to a green economy. So basically, if you are reliant, or if your business is very much reliant on fossil fuels, and then it requires some change, and there's a risk, or at least for some people, if you have, for example, at the moment, invest in an oil refinery, that could, in 20 years to come or so, be a stranded asset, depending on how fast the migration to a new economy goes with less reliance on fossil fuels. So that is more or less environmental. Then the social criteria examine how you manage your relationship with employees, suppliers, customers, and communities. And it includes this idea that the business is not just a business of a profit machine, but that you also care about your communities, and that basically there is some kind of development impact, or some kind of impact, for positive impact for the communities. And then the governance aspect involves a set of standards For company leadership, it deals with basically with transparency in your dealings, internal control, shareholder rights, and then also on the governance side, I think what is nowadays looked at is things like women in leadership positions, things like that, basically the whole gender equality aspect. And yeah, I mean, I guess there are more, depending on which angle you take and where you sit, there are different variations to these, each of these aspects, the environmental, the social, and the governance aspect. And certain institutions may have certain preferences for one or the other thing, or certain focuses on things. And those also depend very much on the business that you are in. For example, also on the social aspect, one thing that's coming to the forefront with, for example, for the smallholder farmers that operate in the cocoa sector. Now, if they sell to the global off-takers, that basically the European companies, those companies are required to ensure that no child labor is used. So if you're a cocoa farmer, you can't just take some of the youths of the village that are supposed to be in school and, they help you on to get the job done. I mean, I guess that would be somehow a problem. So if you want to then supply to the big names, the Cargills or the Nestlés or whatever, then you would need to ensure that basically you don't use child labor. You would need to apply certain standards around use, or there are certain prohibitions maybe in terms of the type of insecticides that you use and so on. So quite a lot of these standards are coming from elsewhere, maybe I would say mainly Europe, but at the end of the day, they can affect the way how you do business. That's on the one side, so that it becomes more like almost like a regulation. On the other hand, you can use it to your benefit in terms of marketing. So if you want to attract a certain type of customer, you can try to hone down on those standards and stand out and attract a certain type of customer, or build a certain reputation in the business environment. So you can use it as a marketing tool. Then there's the other angle that increasingly investors and also lenders, that is, development banks do it already, and then increasingly also commercial banks, they also look towards not just providing money, but going along with that, they want to have an assurance that certain ESG standards are complied with. And there may actually be, for certain businesses or certain themes that fall into certain categories, there may actually be better financial terms attached to it. So, for example, if you do something related to renewable energy or reduction of carbon footprint or so, there is a lot of grant money floating around that may not necessarily be accessible to an individual enterprise directly. But again, there are financial institutions, there are certain firms that could benefit from that if they know the right channels. And so for that reason, it makes sense to be aware of that, of this. Then at the same time, if one looks for business partners and also investors, similarly like the lenders, there are investors that are specifically looking to invest in themes that are ESG aligned and that say, okay, we look at businesses that fit a certain, if you want to call it, ESG profile. And then so following this, one could also find it easier to attract certain business partners if you want.
And while you were speaking, right, I just kept wondering, right? So if these things are really relevant for maybe seeking, if for instance, for marketing, even getting fundings or getting partners, why is it that most small businesses still feel like ESG is meant for large corporations?
Because for large corporations, it's almost a requirement. So if you go and look at the listed companies, and that depends now on listing in certain jurisdictions, but for example, in South Africa and Egypt, those companies, they put out ESG reports. So they have the annual report and then they have the ESG reports. And depending and I guess in Europe and the US is a little bit similar, that you have already, that you are required to fit into certain things. You have to, for example, report on your carbon footprint. And there are certain requirements actually by legislation now that where European companies are required to have certain carbon footprint targets. And that results actually in interesting things. So I picked up on a deal or on it's the Italian oil company. Now they are involved in oil. Oil is carbon intensive. Now they have an obligation to balance that. So what they are doing now is they are having a concession in Congo to basically deal with smallholder farmers that grow soya and other oil crops to create bio oil, biofuel that then gets exported to the EU, and they basically can offset their carbon footprint against that. And so it's not just important for them, because you can see then it also impacts somebody elsewhere on the continent. But with that, I think, I mean, in as much as it's a requirement for large businesses, it filters down to smaller businesses as well. Because, for example, if you want to now deal with a larger business as a supplier, they may, because they are subject to certain standards, they may require from you as a small supplier also a certain profile and say, okay, we're going to deal with you if you adhere to X, Y, Z.
Wow. So, Erin, now looking at the fact that, okay, when we are talking about, let me say, the environmental, let me say, characteristics of the environmental issues, right? Someone might be thinking that, okay, this is mostly linked to maybe non-service businesses, right? So now for a service business, for instance, what should that kind of business be looking into when it comes to like maybe environmental issues?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I
What should they
think
be concerned?
environmental issues are probably for a service delivery business not really that material. I mean, your environmental footprint, I would say, is relatively limited. Depending on what your service is, I mean, there are certain qualifications around that, but you are not. I think the heavy industry is the one standing at the forefront, and then in terms of how they manage their waste and things like that, and also in terms of climate change impact on either side, being impacted by, for example, by physical climate events or then also the transition risk part. So your service business may not necessarily be that much impacted on the environmental side, but it's something to think about. And from various dimensions. So the one is to think about it from a risk perspective. Are there environmental risks? The other one is legislation. Is there any legislation that could impact you? And even if it's not legislation, I mean, if you are a local business and you just have very local clients, probably it's not going to impact you. But if you have, for example, cross-border relationships with other bigger businesses elsewhere, there may be certain things that could spill over and that could impact you. And so it's, just a structured way of thinking to go about it. And then there is the opportunity effect, because I think a lot of the stuff we see it just as, coming onto us as regulation, as burdensome, and where we say, okay, I've got
kind of company, like a small company that is really great kind of company, like a small company that is really growing, right? But it's not bothered, like doesn't just care about ESG as of now.
Yeah, it's about the future. You also need to think about, the longer term, and so those things, they will not go away, I would think. And so it's preparing your business for the future, and at the end of the day, it becomes a issue of competitiveness, where there are other businesses that are more agile, and if they can adopt or conform to certain norms and standards more easily, then they are more competitive. So at the end of the day, once it becomes an issue that can affect you on your competitiveness, then it should be better, then it should be something to worry about.
So, talk to me about, okay, let's look at the other side of the coin, right? Someone who has accepted that, yeah, I need to be conscious of ESG. I want to do everything right. So, but the person is worried, right? Despite all the efforts that I'm putting in, I don't know how to measure the impact of that. So, are there some possible measuring tools or some KPIs that you can actually measure, right, to be able to track the impact that you're creating as a result of being adherent to maybe ESG principles?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, what you need to figure out is, and like I said, this whole ESG is very wide and very broad, and even the categories, environmental, governance, and social, are also broad categories. So you would need to narrow down and say, for my business, what's important. And then from there, you can maybe document certain principles or so, and come up with certain measures and say, those are my targets, and then measure that. And it helps. And nowadays, it has really taken off that everybody is talking about ESG. But when I think back, when I started my career, my first job was in a bank. And at that time, we didn't know what ESG was. But and then I think probably at the time it was quite a new thing. But they were saying, oh, we report a triple bottom line. So what does that mean? That meant that they report also on the social aspects, not just the net profit, but also what they are doing for the community. And so there was a small part of the profit that went into some kind of a community trust to finance projects with grant funds. And so that was part of the reporting. And the bank basically used it as kind of a marketing material to say, look, we are not just here to make, but we also care about the community, and we care about adding, giving back to the community and things like that. So it was done a bit in a way underpinned by a marketing strategy. But that's really, if we talk about now about the social aspect and about stakeholder relationships and about relationships with the community and so on, I think that would fall squarely into that. And so I think there are different kind of strategies. So not everybody needs to do the same, unless, of course, you are in a position where you're already required to do certain things because, a supplier requires this or so. But even then, it would be good if you can actually measure that, because your supplier would, for example, require accountability on those things.
So, I mean, what about some people that just use this as, in short, use it for window dressing, right? You have some companies that are kind of like, you have images out there, okay, we are ensuring that the sure that maybe it's really not happening, right? It's just kind of like, okay, can the customers see that we are doing this? So, what do you have to say to them, or what can be done about it?
Yeah. No, so I think that is one very big issue in and I think people are quite aware that certain companies are doing that. They call it greenwashing, where they just go out and make all these
Okay, pretty
wonderful
much.
claims, and at the end of the day, they're nothing about that. They're nothing like that. And I mean, I think that since this idea of greenwashing is already out there, people also look out and want to have assurance that you're not just putting up a show and pretending, and then at the end of the day, you really don't care. And so I think over the longer term, if you just do things for the show, you will be found out. Yeah, because at the end of the day, you will not be able to hide it. Yeah.
Mhm. So, I mean, can we look at some real life examples of how, let me say, if you really want to, if you really care, right, about the environment, about those people that you're working with, about your shareholders and the governance structures, right? So, what are some practical examples that we should be looking at? I know maybe we've talked a lot about the environment, but now let's look at the social aspect, right? What are some of the things that you should be doing to actually prove that you care? The reason why I'm asking this question is because you have some organizations that might actually, let me say, entrepreneurs that will be listening to us today and they'll be like, okay, I think this makes sense. But what exactly should I be doing to show that maybe I care for my suppliers, my employees, and all of that? What exactly should I be doing? And later on, maybe let's turn the governance structure.
Yeah. So I mean, I think on the social criteria, it's about, well, your relationships. I mean, how are you managing your employees? Are you known in the as the big exploiter or not? Like, do you take advantage? I mean, or are your employee relationships fairly good? And even if you don't, maybe you don't even need to do something special, but your track record can speak for you. If you have a high employee turnover and people just run away and you need to hire every other month, you need to hire new people because they can't stay with you, clearly there's a problem. And even on that score, if that's something like that, then you need to work on it because you have a problem in your business. It's not good for the business to have this type of situation. And that's where actually this understanding of ESG can also improve your business to have a better business. Now, if you have employees that have been there for years and they're quite content where they are, then I think that's a plus. The same thing goes with customer relationships. I mean, how do you have a lot of, I mean, are your customers happy customers? Again, if they are, good for you. I mean, you're running a wonderful business. If the customers are running away and you always have to find new ones, also maybe not. So in a lot of cases, it ties up with good business management, with good practice that you should follow anyway. And in that sense, it's not necessarily that special. There may be special situations, of course, where, I mean, I mentioned this thing around child labor, which is quite a pertinent one coming up in various discussions. So I think in the agriculture space, sourcing of agriculture, that is a theme. Similarly, in the production of solar panels, I think that has come up now. What they typically ask is to provide a to provide a detailed kind of spec of the origin, where do the solar panels come from, and that there was no child labor involved, things like that. But I mean, those are things that wouldn't necessarily touch every business. But the thing that are quite universal to businesses are your employees, your customers, maybe your suppliers, those type of relationships. Unions, very important. Not for all business, but again, for some businesses, I mean, they can be quite destructive if you have unionized labor and are exposed to it. So better you manage your relationship with your union well. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to give in to every demand that they make. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a negotiation. And one has to also convince them about that the business needs to remain sustainable and so on. But to the extent that this relationship becomes strained and you are exposed to strikes and things like that, maybe it's better to be avoided. Similarly, other stakeholders are your regulators. If you are in a regulated environment, you want to have a good relationship with your regulator. You don't want to be on in fighting mode. And then maybe similar to that, the receiver of revenue is not the most loved place in the world, but yeah, I mean, try to be on good terms with them as well.
So, Erwin, what about the governance structure, right? So, what should you do in order to be adherent?
Governance, it's around transparency in your governance. It obviously depends on the size of your business. If you are owner-operator, I mean, you own the business and you run the business, and there is not much else. But at the same time, we spoke about succession planning the other day. Normally, in terms of good governance, there would be some kind of a succession. There would be some kind of a plan how that things can operate without you as the owner being there 24/7. I think that's usually a good thing. Then if you have a slightly larger organization, transparency and also that you have assurance that there is no kind of conflict of interest, that decisions are taken in a way that, that conflict of interest is avoided. And if you have shareholders, I mean, obviously they want to insist on proper accountability. I think that's very important. Then on a wider scope, if for larger organizations, this thing about gender equality always comes up. How many women do you have in leadership positions? How many women have you employed in the board, and so on? Now, that's quite specific to the development banks. They usually ask that. But I think it's also something that filters through to other domains where, for example, I mean, there are various loan schemes and so on that try to give or promote women-owned businesses and things like that. So that's another subset on the governance side.
Erin, thank you. So let's talk a little bit. Let's expatiate. No, I'm a woman, so let's expatiate a little bit on the kind of like gender balance, right? So what do you think about it, or how do you think about the way maybe companies are approaching it, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it obviously depends on the nature of the business. I mean, I think in general it's probably good to have some gender balance. Now, if you are, and I think on the governance side, which is probably not that much exposed to physical labor, so it's okay. If you, for example, a mining company, or if you are a car repair company, you are a mechanic, what is the chance that you will have 50% women mechanics or something like that around? I mean, not necessarily very high. It's not the typical space where you see women getting engaged. So I think one needs to balance that as well, and keep that in mind.
Okay, that's nice. I mean, I think,
but I think there are sort of just on that, and I think that goes to the credit of female entrepreneurs. There have been studies that show that default rates are lower for women-owned businesses, and I think maybe it's due to the fact that women tend to take less risks or be more conscious of risks and so on, which again is also something good to know. And
I mean, thank you so much for this discussion on ESG today. I think it's a very relevant discussion, and it's true that most of the times we actually kind of like neglect it, especially as small businesses. But creating awareness around it, I think it's very relevant, because at least it makes us understand that these are things that we should start looking at them, despite the fact that we are still small. So I really appreciate you taking the time for us to discuss this. But my last question will really be around investors. Are investors really curious around this, especially maybe when they are looking at small businesses, or they are taking the step where they kind of like, okay, I'm going to be able to empower the small businesses to start doing it. So if I'm a small business right now and maybe I don't necessarily have the resources to take I can start practicing maybe the social, the governance part, and if there are some let me say larger some steps that I need to take that maybe might require a lot of expenditure, can I actually postpone it to the future, right? Or are the investors really wanting to see the steps that as a small business you're actually making towards this towards adhering to some of these principles before investing?
So I mean, I think that depends really on the investor profile, but there are quite a number of investors that look specifically for businesses that fit a certain ESG profile, and that is because they are running, or they advertise themselves to be investing in ESG businesses. It's an interesting investment theme for them, so they thrive on that. And then obviously they select businesses that are fitting that profile. Now you may find investors that are not that selective, and that may be also more patient, that say, okay, if you have a plan and for that in the long run, it's fine. But it's just that I think obviously, I mean, it can help you that securing contracts, it can help you to attract a certain type of investor that you ordinarily may not necessarily be able to get if you are looking for an investor. It can boost your competitive edge and maybe enhance your resilience. So yes, I mean there are certain advantages to it, and so now I think it's maybe up to the business to say, okay, how important is it for us? Maybe you don't need an investor at the moment, and so really it's not necessarily on your top priority list, but again, it's useful to think about it and to think also, could there be opportunities in there? Because it's not only all about compliance and regulation. I mean, in Europe, for large companies, there's a whole lot of reporting and in the meantime, it has become a compliance issue. But at the same time, I see also especially for smaller businesses. There could be opportunities in there.
Erwin, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this session. Thank you so much for always finding time to come and talk to us. And to me, I always enjoy these discussions because I think it reinforces what maybe I think. Sometimes it actually just opens my mind into the possibilities around making money, right? Because there are times that when you're so focused on making money, right, you kind of like forget other aspects that will make you make more money, right? So you just think of maybe the limited money at that point in time, this the little that you're seeing, and you forget about the future, what the future can. But I think with what we just discussed today, if more and more entrepreneurs actually get into the thought process of making sure that it's like that, they think about the environment, they think about the social and governance consequences of our actions, I think we can actually make smarter decisions. So thank you so much for taking our time to be with us. And I love the fact that you always give us experience and kind of like share with us practical examples from your experience. So thank you very much. It means a lot to us. And
yeah, thank you,
see you
Shirley.
next week.
It was nice being with you.
All right. So, to our audience, thank you so much, Erwin. And to our audience, thank you so much. Remember, we are here because you're there. And on this edition, yeah. Thank you, Erwin. To our audience, thank you so much for being with us today. Remember, we are here because you're there. And remember, on this edition, we were looking at everything related to environment, social, and governance principles, right? Why it matters to your business. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for being in our company. And remember, see you next week, same time. Thank you. Love you. And regards to your families. Bye.